It's Dr. T, and in this episode, we are answering the question, why is there so much homelessness in the United States? So, to give you some recent data, in 2023, there were over 650,000 people who experienced homelessness at some point. 1 in 6 was a child. This represents a 12% increase from the year before of 2022. So there has been a real concern about the increase in homelessness and the affordability of housing here in the United States. We also need to keep in mind, anytime we're talking about this, the problem of what we call undercounting. It's very difficult to get an accurate count of how many people don't have homes, because when we do census work, we rely on people's dwellings as a way to find them, to find out about them. And so we have a lot of people who may be euphemistically called couch surfing. They're staying with friends or family members, but they don't actually have a permanent place to live, and they may not be counted in these numbers. So numbers are likely much higher than any official statistic that you'll see. So who's at risk for homelessness? Well, there are two main life events that can precipitate homelessness, can lead to homelessness. One is a job loss. Obviously, if you lose your income, it's very difficult to hang on to your place to live for most of us. The other big risk factor is divorce. Women, particularly if their partner has left them, has abandoned them financially, have a hard time in an economy where women tend to be paid less than men to be able to survive with themselves and their children on just one income, particularly when they were used to two. Other contributing factors we see are substance abuse, as you might guess, is sometimes a factor leading to homelessness. Untreated mental illness or unstably treated mental illness can be a contributing factor. In fact, we'll see historically veterans with untreated PTSD are at very high risk for ending up without a home. Runaways and throwaways. These are usually young people who run away from home because their home life is intolerable. There may be abuse going on in the home. They may have been thrown away for a variety of reasons. There might be a new partner, adult partner in the home who doesn't like the child. Young women historically, if they become pregnant, have been thrown out of their homes. LGBTQ plus youth, their parents don't accept them for who they are and throw them out of the house. Those are definitely possibilities. The thing that we should really be paying attention to is that for the last several decades, the rising numbers of homelessness are fueled by families, however, and they could even be intact families, not just necessarily families that have experienced divorce, but because of a job loss, intact families can end up on the streets. So, historical trends. We've seen homelessness increase since the 1970s. Probably the first category of individuals who fueled the beginnings of the increase of homelessness were Vietnam vets. They were treated very poorly when they came back from the war. They were the first generation of fighting soldiers who were not treated as heroes when they came home. There was a lot of controversy about the Vietnam War, and they were met with a lot of hostility. And so that made what they had experienced in the war and the fallout from that in terms of their mental health, particularly PTSD, that complicated that and made it that much worse. As we moved from the 70s into the 80s, that were under the Reagan administration, there was a big push for deinstitutionalization to get people out of mental health facilities. There was a lot of reporting going on that the facilities run by state and federal governments that were housing and supposedly caring for people with mental health challenges were not doing a good job. The term that was applied to them in many cases was snake pit. It was just a terrible, terrible place to live. Instead of cleaning up the institutions, there was a big push to deinstitutionalize and move people out of institutions. The logic being, people were better off in their own community where they would still have relationships with people that they knew, that cared about them, and that could help them. The problem is that people were just pushed out of these institutions without any effort made to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. So there's supposed to be a network of community clinics that was built up so people would have a place to go to get their medications, to see psychiatrists and counselors and so forth. That funding never came. So it just became a way to cut funding for mental health treatment without actually providing support for people, and many of these folks ended up on the streets. Also in the 1980s, you get this trend that we now refer to as gentrification. So we talked in the episode on urban centers and some of the decay and the de-investment in urban centers, about how there's a lot of poverty and a lot of crumbling infrastructure and housing and so forth in some of our urban centers. In the 1980s, there was this idea that they would come and take some of these spaces where the housing stock was deteriorating or businesses had left, and some developer would come in with a lot of money, or a partnership of developers would come in and they would renovate this. They would gut the houses and make them spectacular places to live. They would bring new businesses, and all of this was done to attract people who had money back to the city to live and to spend their money. Again, not a terrible idea from an economic standpoint for cities, but there was no plan made for providing for or seeing that the people who lived in this previously very low income housing, because it was not well maintained and it was all people could afford, no provision for them being able to go someplace else. They were just evicted. And so many of them ended up on the streets. And more recently, with the housing bubble bursting in 2006 and then the collapse of the housing mortgage market in 2008 that caused the Great Recession, there's been a lot of buying up of things that were formerly privately owned by small entities or individuals by larger corporations and then run as landlords. And they have just continued to jack up rents and gouge prices especially in urban areas again. And so people have found themselves priced out of the housing market. And so we are in not just a homelessness crisis, but also affordable housing crisis at this point. Rising cost of living, of course, has contributed to this in our urban areas, but also, as we mentioned in a previous episode, in tourist areas, out in rural areas that are beautiful and attract people to go skiing or hiking or do other things of an outdoorsy sorts of nature. That means that beauty, that natural beauty, people want to be there. And so folks with money come in and start driving up the housing prices. And then people who've lived there all along or who work in industries that support the tourists don't have any place to live that's affordable. Something very important to note is that we talked in a recent episode about the minimum wage and how it has not kept up with the rising cost of living. There is no state in this country, in the United States, where someone who is making minimum wage can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Now, there are places that are run down and not taken care of and have pest infestation and, heat that doesn't work all the time and bad water and that sort of thing. Yes, people are able to find places to live, but not places that are clean and that are where most of us would want to live. So we mentioned gentrification. Urban development is an important piece of this too, because when people are thinking about what to do with space that is available with the city or how to plan for the short, medium, and long term of the city, the future, they think about trying to attract business and trying to attract economic investment, trying to make sure that there's sufficient housing stock, particularly low-cost housing stock for people of lesser means, is not typically something that's on the table in these discussions. One last thing I want to throw out here before we conclude is that how we talk about this problem matters. The terms that we use have different implications. So when we talk about someone experiencing homelessness, we usually mean they don't have permanent shelter. They don't have a place to live. But we could use other terms like unhoused or even uprooted, because it is possible that people can have shelter but be displaced from the communities that they grew up in and from the relationships, the ties that they've had over time, which is another loss. The shelter is not the only thing people need. People need to be connected to others and to experience a sense of community and support. And so you can be housed but not have community if you're pulled out of your community and sent someplace else to live. You could be unhoused and actually have community. Sociologist Mitch Denier wrote a book in the 90s called Sidewalk about people who lived on the street without permanent dwelling, but actually had created ties of caring between each other and supported each other in a variety of ways. Uprooted is probably the best term to describe what happens when people lose their permanent housing, because they typically have to go to a different geographic location and they lose that sense of community. And so any approaches to trying to address the housing crisis and trying to prevent homelessness and move people from homelessness to permanent housing needs to take all of these things into consideration.